Y'all, I'm telling you right now, what I found in my ceiling that cold February morning changed everything I thought I knew about my family. And honey, I still get goosebumps thinking about those scratching sounds that kept me awake for 3 whole months. The sound started right above my kitchen table, where I'd been eating my morning oatmeal for 47 years. And let me tell you something, when you're 72 years old and living alone in Phoenix, Arizona, the last thing you want is mysterious noises coming from places you can't see. My name is Dorothy, and I've been living in this little ranch house on Maple Street since 1978, back when my Harold was still alive, and my two boys, Michael and James, were just teenagers, eating me at a house and home. Now it's just me, my morning coffee, and apparently whatever creature decided to make my attic its personal playground. But sweetie, before I tell you what I discovered up there, and honey, this part is gonna absolutely shock you. If you're loving the story, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. You know I get so excited when I see y'all in the comments. Speaking of which, what state are you calling home right now? Drop it down below. And tell me honestly, have you ever heard strange noises in your house that made you wonder if you were losing your mind? Because your stories help me know I'm not alone in this crazy world. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because what I found was about to turn my entire world upside down in the most beautiful way. It all started on a Tuesday morning in November, right after Thanksgiving dinner had gone particularly badly with my sons. Michael had brought his new girlfriend, Jessica, some young thing who kept checking her phone and barely touched my famous sweet potato casserole that I'd been perfecting since before she was born. James showed up 2 hours late with some excuse about work, even though I knew he'd been at the sports bar watching football because his neighbor Mrs. Patterson told me she saw his truck there. The whole dinner felt forced, like they were doing me some kind of favor by showing up. And honey, I could feel that familiar ache in my chest when they both rushed out before dessert, claiming they had other plans. That's when the scratching started. Right after I'd finished washing all the dishes by myself, standing at my kitchen sink, wondering when my boys had become strangers. At first, I thought maybe it was just the old house settling, how these Arizona houses can be with the temperature changes. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like something was moving around up there with purpose. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Always in the same spot, right above where I kept my recipe box on the kitchen counter. For the first week, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a family of pack rats that had found their way into my attic space. Lord knows we get enough of those critters here in Phoenix, especially when the weather starts cooling down. But the scratching wasn't random like animals would be, sweetie. It happened at the same times every day, early in the morning, around 6 a.m., when I was making my coffee, and again in the evening, around 7 p.m., when I was fixing my dinner. It was almost like whatever was up there knew my schedule. I called Michael first because he's my oldest and used to help his daddy with house repairs before Harold passed. When I told him about the sounds, I could hear him sighing on the other end of the phone, that same exasperated sound he'd made as a teenager when I'd asked him to take out the trash. Mom, it's probably just mice or something. You can call an exterminator if it bothers you that much. The way he said it, like I was being dramatic or making a big deal out of nothing, made my voice crack just a little. Michael, honey, I've lived in this house for over 40 years. I know what mice sound like, and this isn't mice. But he was already rushing me off the phone, saying Jessica was cooking dinner and he needed to go. Cooking dinner, can you believe that? I'd been cooking dinner for that boy for 18 years, and now some girl he'd known for 6 months was more important than his own mother's concerns? I let out the longest breath you ever heard after I hung up that phone, feeling all the air leave my lungs at once, like someone had just told me my worst fears about my boys were true. So I called James next, my baby boy who used to curl up with me on the couch during thunderstorms, who used to say I was his best friend in the whole world. But James was even worse than Michael, barely letting me finish explaining about the scratching before he cut me off. Mom, you're probably just hearing the house settling, or maybe the neighbor's dog. You worry too much about everything. The dismissal in his voice hit me like a slap, and I found myself whispering like someone might overhear. "James, sweetie, I'm not imagining things. There's something up there, and it's getting louder every night." But he was already making excuses about having to work late, about his boss expecting some big presentation, about how busy his life was. Busy, 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 always too busy for their mother, who had given them everything, who had worked double shifts at the diner to pay for their school clothes, who had sat up all night when they were sick with fevers and scraped knees. After I hung up with James, I could barely get the words out. I was so disappointed. The words came out softer than a church mouse. 47 years I've been their mother, and now I can't even get 5 minutes of their time? The scratching got worse after those phone calls. Like whatever was up there could sense my loneliness, my growing isolation from the two people who were supposed to care about me most. Every morning at 6 a.m., scratch, 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 right above my head as I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and my scrambled eggs. Every evening at 7 p.m., scratch, 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 as I heated up my Stouffer's frozen dinner because cooking for one person felt too sad most days. By December, I was barely sleeping, sweetie. The scratching had expanded from just above the kitchen to other parts of the ceiling, like whatever was up there was exploring, mapping out my entire house. I'd lie in bed at night listening to the sounds move from the kitchen area to above my living room, then back towards what I thought might be above my bedroom closet. It was methodical, purposeful, and it was driving me absolutely crazy. I tried calling my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, thinking maybe she'd heard something from her side of our shared fence, but she just looked at me with that pitying expression that people get when they think you're losing your marbles. Imagine things. Can you believe that? Like I hadn't been living in reality for 7 decades? Like I was some confused old woman who couldn't tell the difference between real sounds and hallucinations. That's when I started keeping a notebook, writing down every time I heard the scratching, what time it happened, how long it lasted, and exactly where it seemed to be coming from. Call me crazy, but I was determined to prove to myself and everyone else that I wasn't imagining things. The pattern became clear pretty quickly, y'all. The scratching happened most frequently above my kitchen and living room, always during my regular daily activities, almost like whatever was up there knew my routine and wanted to be part of it somehow.
Christmas came and went with the usual disappointment. Michael and Jessica sent a card with a generic message, and James called for exactly 4 minutes on Christmas morning before rushing off to spend the day with his girlfriend's family. I spent Christmas dinner alone with my scratching companion, and I'll admit, I found myself talking to whatever was up there. "Well, at least you're consistent," I said to my ceiling, cutting into my store-bought ham. "At least you show up every day." The scratching seemed to respond, getting a little louder, a little more insistent, and for the first time in months, I felt less alone in my own house. Isn't that something, sweetie? A mysterious sound in my ceiling was better company than my own flesh and blood. By January, I'd filled up half that notebook with observations, and I was starting to notice things that made my heart race with possibilities I didn't want to consider. The scratching wasn't random at all. It was responding to me. When I'd call out, "Is someone there?" the scratching would pause for exactly 3 seconds, then resume. When I'd tap on the ceiling with a broomstick, the scratching would tap back. Same rhythm, same number of taps. One evening in late January, I was heating up some soup when the scratching got so loud it sounded like whatever was up there was trying to break through my ceiling. I dropped my spoon, and honey, you could hear the mischief just dancing in my voice when I looked up and said, "All right, enough is enough. We need to have a conversation." The scratching stopped immediately, complete silence for the first time in 3 months, and I knew right then and there that I wasn't dealing with any ordinary pest problem. This was something else entirely, something that could understand me, something that had been trying to communicate with me all this time while my own sons couldn't be bothered to return my phone calls. That's when I made the decision that would change everything, sweetie. I was going to get up in that attic and see exactly what had been keeping me company all these lonely months. The very next morning, I dragged Harold's old aluminum ladder out of the garage, the same ladder he'd used to string Christmas lights every December for 25 years until his arthritis got too bad. My hands were shaking like autumn leaves as I positioned it under the attic access panel in my hallway ceiling, and I'll tell you what, climbing that ladder at 72 years old felt like the bravest thing I'd ever done in my life. The attic access panel hadn't been opened in probably 10 years, not since the pest control guy had gone up there to check for termites after Harold passed. The metal panel was stuck, and I had to push with both hands to get it to move, sending down a shower of dust that made me cough and sneeze. But honey, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I finally got that panel open and shined my flashlight up into that dark space. There, in the corner of my attic, was a small area that had been turned into what could only be described as a living space. Someone had laid out old blankets, arranged some of my missing kitchen items, plates I thought I'd lost, cups that had disappeared from my cabinet, even my good silver serving spoon that I'd been looking for since Thanksgiving. There were water bottles, crackers, a small camping lantern, and y'all, I couldn't believe what I was seeing with my own two eyes. But that's not even the shocking part, sweetie. Sitting in the corner of this makeshift living space was a young man, maybe 19 or 20 years old, with the same dark hair and brown eyes as my James, wearing a dirty jacket that looked like it had seen better days. When our eyes met in the beam of my flashlight, I had to stop and catch my breath because I was looking at the face of my grandson Danny, James's boy, who I hadn't seen in over 2 years. "Grandma Dorothy?" he whispered, and honey, his voice was rougher than I remembered, older and sadder, but it was definitely my Danny. "I'm sorry about the noise. I tried to be quiet when you were sleeping." I couldn't stop the tears from spilling over as I realized that my grandson, my sweet Danny, who used to spend summers with me and Harold, who used to help me bake cookies and plant tomatoes in my garden, had been living in my attic for 3 months. 3 months of scratching sounds, 3 months of feeling like I was going crazy, and all along it was my own grandson trying to survive in the space above my head. "Danny, baby, what are you doing up there?" I managed to whisper, my voice breaking right in half. Getting Danny down from that attic was like trying to coax a scared animal out of hiding, sweetie. He was so thin I could see his ribs through his torn t-shirt, and his hands were dirty and rough like he'd been living outdoors for months before he'd found his way to my house. As we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd been hearing his movements above my head, Danny told me a story that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. He'd been homeless since his 18th birthday, when James had kicked him out of the house for dropping out of college and wasting his potential. My son, my baby boy James, had put his own child out on the street and never told me, never asked for my help, never even mentioned that Danny was struggling. For 2 years, my grandson had been living in his car, staying in shelters, working odd jobs just to survive, all while I was sitting in this house every night wishing I had more family time. "Dame said you were getting old and didn't need the stress of my problems," Danny said, and I could feel those tears starting to sting because I realized James had been making decisions about my life, about who I could and couldn't help without even asking me. He said I had enough to worry about and that I needed to figure things out on my own like a man. Y'all, I let out this bitter little laugh because the irony was overwhelming. Here I had been calling James about scratching sounds in my ceiling, worried about some pest problem, while my own grandson was living above my head, hungry and scared and thinking his grandmother didn't want to help him. James had ignored my calls about the sounds, dismissed my concerns, made me feel like I was being dramatic, all while knowing his own son was the source of those sounds. "How long have you been up there, baby?" I asked, reaching across the table to take his dirty hands in mine. He said from right after Thanksgiving, and suddenly everything made perfect sense. The timing, the pattern, the way the scratching seemed to respond to my daily routine. Danny had been watching me, learning my schedule, trying to move around when he thought it would disturb me the least. He'd been stealing food from my kitchen in small amounts, things he hoped I wouldn't notice. A can of soup here, some crackers there, just enough to survive. He said, "I broke in through the attic vent on the side of the house. I saw the light in your kitchen every morning and evening, and it reminded me of when I was little and you'd make me breakfast before school. I just wanted to be close to family, even if you didn't know I was here." The more Danny talked, the angrier I got at James, sweetie. Not just angry, but furious in a way I hadn't felt since Harold died and left me to figure everything out on my own. My son had let his child become homeless rather than swallow his pride. He had cut off his own flesh and blood and never said a word to me, never asked for my help, never even considered that maybe an old grandmother might have wisdom and love to offer, even if she didn't have much money.
"Danny, baby, you're not going anywhere," I told him, and you could hear the determination growing in my voice. "This is your home now for as long as you want to stay. We're going to get you cleaned up, fed properly, and figure this whole mess out together. But first, I had a phone call to make, and honey, I was going to enjoy this conversation more than I'd enjoyed anything in years." I picked up that phone and called James, and for once, he was going to listen to every word I had to say without rushing me off or making excuses about being busy. "James William Henderson," I said when he answered, using his full name like I did when he was in trouble as a boy. "You are going to sit down and listen to your mother, and you are not going to say one word until I'm finished talking." I could hear him trying to interrupt, trying to use that patronizing tone he developed since he gotten his fancy job and his fancy apartment, but I cut him off quick. "I said not one word, James. I've been hearing scratching in my ceiling for 3 months, and do you remember what you told me when I called you for help?" The silence on the other end told me he was starting to realize where this conversation was headed, and sweetie, I was just getting started. "You told me it was probably mice. You told me I worried too much. You made me feel like a foolish old woman who was imagining things." Well, James, I found out what was making those sounds, and it wasn't mice. I paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. It was Danny, your son, my grandson, the boy you threw out of your house like he was garbage, who's been living in my attic for 3 months, hungry and scared and thinking his own family didn't want him. The sound James made was somewhere between a gasp and a groan, and I knew he understood that his secret was out, that his attempt to hide his cruelty from his mother had backfired spectacularly. "Mom, I can explain," he started, but I wasn't having it. "No, James, you cannot explain. You cannot explain why you put a child on the street. You cannot explain why you let me worry about ceiling sounds for 3 months when you knew exactly what they were. And you sure as hell cannot explain why you thought it was your place to decide that I was too old to help my own grandson." Y'all could hear the pure excitement in my voice because finally, after months of feeling dismissed and ignored, I had the upper hand with my sons. Finally, I had proof that they didn't know everything, that their mother still had surprises up her sleeve. "Danny is staying with me," I continued, "and if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with someone who cares about your opinion, because that someone is not me anymore." I hung up on James before he could respond, something I'd never done in my entire life, and the sound of that phone hitting the cradle felt like freedom. Within 10 minutes, my phone was ringing, James calling back, then Michael calling, probably after James had called him in a panic. But you know what, sweetie? I didn't answer those calls. For the first time in my 72 years, I was too busy to take my son's calls. Instead, Danny and I spent the afternoon cleaning him up, getting him a proper shower and some of Harold's old clothes that I kept in the closet. We went to the grocery store together, and I let Danny fill the car with all his favorite foods, things I remembered him loving as a child: chocolate chip cookies, strawberry milk, those frozen pizzas that taste like cardboard but somehow make kids happy. At the store, I introduced Danny to everyone I knew, Mrs. Chen from the pharmacy, Bobby who bags groceries, even the manager, Mr. Rodriguez, who always asks about my arthritis. I said, "This is my grandson, Danny. He's staying with me now." The looks on their faces were priceless, sweetie, because everyone in this neighborhood had heard me complaining about how my boys never visited, never called, never seemed to care about their old mother. That evening, Danny and I cooked dinner together in my kitchen, the first real meal I'd made for family in months. As we worked side by side, browning ground beef for spaghetti and making garlic bread from scratch, I kept looking up at the ceiling where I'd heard those scratching sounds for so long. Now I knew every one of those sounds had been my grandson trying to be part of my life in the only way he thought he could. "Grandma," Danny said while we waited for the pasta water to boil, "I heard you talking to me sometimes through the ceiling, when you say goodnight to whatever was up there, or when you tell the scratching sounds about your day." I felt my cheeks getting warm, 'cause I remembered those one-sided conversations, how crazy they made me feel. "I was so lonely, baby. Your daddy and Uncle Michael barely call anymore, and I guess I was just desperate for some kind of company, even if it was mysterious scratching sounds. I heard everything, Grandma. When you cry after talking to Dad on the phone, when you tell the ceiling about how empty the house felt, when you sing those old songs while you cooked, it made me feel less alone too." Right then and there, y'all, I understood that those 3 months hadn't been about pest problems or strange house sounds. They'd been about two lonely people, separated by just a few inches of drywall and insulation, both desperate for family connection that we thought we couldn't have. The phone kept ringing throughout dinner, James calling, Michael calling, even Jessica calling on Michael's behalf, but we ignored every single ring. Instead, Danny and out told me about his life over the past 2 years, the jobs he'd worked and lost, the nights he'd slept in his car, the times he thought about reaching out to me, but believed what his father had told him about me being too fragile to handle his problems. "Dad made it sound like you were barely managing on your own, like any extra stress might put you in a nursing home or something," Danny said, and I could feel my anger at James reaching a whole new level. "Danny, baby, I've been managing just fine on my own for 12 years since my grandpa died. I balance my own checkbook, maintain this house, drive myself everywhere I need to go, and I sure as hell don't need anyone deciding what I can and cannot handle." After dinner, we set up the spare bedroom for Danny, the room that used to be his daddy James's room, with the same blue walls and baseball posters that James had insisted on keeping even after he moved out. It felt right having Harold's grandson sleeping in Harold's son's old room, like the house was finally being used for its intended purpose, sheltering family who needed shelter. That night, for the first time in 3 months, my house was completely quiet. No scratching, no mysterious sounds, just the peaceful silence of a home where people cared about each other. But around 11 p.m., there was a loud knocking at my front door, the kind of insistent knocking that means someone's either very excited or very angry. I looked through my peephole and saw James standing on my porch, his face red and his hair messed up like he'd been running his hands through it. Behind him was Michael, looking uncomfortable and fidgety, like he'd been dragged into something he didn't want to deal with. "Boys," I said when I opened the door, not inviting them in, "it's past my bedtime. What do you want?" "Mom, we need to talk about Danny," James said, trying to push past me into the house. "This situation is complicated, and you don't understand everything that's happened."
"Oh, I understand plenty, James," I replied, blocking his entrance. "I understand that you threw your son out of your house. I understand that you let me worry about scratching sounds in my ceiling while you knew exactly what they were. And I understand that you think your mother is too stupid or too senile to make her own decisions about who lives in her own house."
Michael stepped forward, trying to play peacemaker like he'd done when the boys were little and fighting over toys. Mom, maybe Danny could stay with one of us for a while until we figure out a better long-term solution. I let out this laugh that was sharp as broken glass, sweetie, because the audacity of these men was absolutely unbelievable. A better long-term solution? Michael, your brother put this child on the street rather than deal with his problems like a father should. Now you want to shuffle him around between you like he's some kind of burden instead of a human being who needs stability and love? Mom, you're 72 years old, James said, and I could hear the condescension dripping from every word. Taking care of a teenager is a lot of responsibility. What if he gets into trouble? What if he brings problems to your door? You live alone in this house, and you're vulnerable. That's when Danny appeared behind me in the doorway, showered and fed and looking healthier than he'd probably looked in months. The expression on James's face when he saw his son was a mixture of shame and anger, like he was mad at Danny for existing, for being proof of James's failure as a father. "Hi, Dad," Danny said quietly, and you could hear years of hurt in those two simple words. James couldn't even look at his own child, sweetie. He kept his eyes focused on me, like Danny was some kind of embarrassment that he didn't want to acknowledge. "Danny, you need to come home with me. We can work this out, but you can't stay here and burden your grandmother." "Burden?" I said, and my voice was getting louder with every word. "James William Henderson, that boy has been better company in one afternoon than you've been in the past 5 years. He helped me cook dinner. He told me about his life. He listened to my stories, and he didn't once check his phone or make excuses about needing to be somewhere else." "Mom, you're being dramatic," Michael chimed in, and I turned on him with all the fury of a woman who'd been called dramatic one too many times. "Dramatic, Michael? Your brother's son was living in my attic like some kind of refugee, and I'm being dramatic for wanting to help him? Where exactly is the drama in giving a homeless child a warm bed and regular meals?" The argument continued on my front porch for another 20 minutes, with my sons trying every manipulation tactic they'd learned as children. Guilt trips about my age, concerns about my safety, suggestions that I wasn't thinking clearly. But for every argument they made, I had a better response. And Danny stood beside me the whole time, quiet but present, letting me fight for him the way nobody had fought for him in 2 years. Finally, James played his last card, the one I'd been expecting since the moment I saw him on my porch. "Mom, if you insist on keeping Danny here, we're going to have to consider other options. Maybe it's time to look into assisted living facilities where you'll have people checking on you regularly, making sure you're making good decisions." The threat hung in the air like smoke, sweetie, and I could see Michael looking uncomfortable with his brother's words, but not disagreeing with them either. They were threatening to put me in a nursing home because I wanted to help my grandson, because I'd made a decision they didn't approve of, because I dared to have an opinion about my own life. But you know what, y'all? I'd been preparing for this moment since the day Harold died, and I realized I was going to have to fight for my independence. I looked James straight in the eye and smiled the sweetest, most satisfied smile I'd ever managed. "James, honey, you go right ahead and try to put me in a nursing home, but first, you might want to know what your son told me about why he really left college and why he was really living on the streets. See, Danny told me all about your gambling problem, sweetie. He told me about the money you stole from his college fund to pay off your debts. He told me about the threats from those men who came to the house looking for you, and how you told him it was his fault for being expensive to raise." My voice was getting stronger with every revelation, every secret that James thought he'd kept hidden from his family. "He also told me about the life insurance policy you took out on me last year without telling me. The one where you're the beneficiary?"
Imagine my surprise when I found out my own son was betting on when his mother would die. The look on James's face was worth every minute of scratching sounds I endured, sweetie. Michael was staring at his brother like he was seeing a stranger, and Danny was looking up at me with something that might have been respect. So here's what's going to happen, James. Danny is staying with me, and you're going to leave us alone to figure out our own lives. If you try to interfere, if you try to have me declared incompetent, if you even think about threatening me again, I'm going to make sure everyone in this family knows exactly what kind of man you really are. I stepped back and put my arm around Danny's shoulders, feeling more powerful and more sure of myself than I'd felt in years. Now get off my porch before I call the police and report you for harassment. James and Michael left without another word, but I could hear them arguing in heated whispers as they walked to their cars. Michael seemed shocked by the revelations about James's gambling and the insurance policy, and I had a feeling their relationship was about to get very complicated. That night, Danny and I sat up late in my living room, talking about everything. His dreams, his fears, his plans for the future. We talked about Harold, about the grandfather he'd barely gotten to know before he passed. We talked about Harold's workshop in the garage, all his tools and projects that had been sitting untouched for 12 years because I couldn't bear to clean them out. Grandpa was teaching me woodworking the summer before he died. He said I had good hands for detail work. Well then, baby, that workshop is yours now. Harold would love knowing his tools were being used again, that his grandson was carrying on his love of building things. Over the following weeks, Danny and I fell into a routine that felt more natural than anything I'd experienced since Harold passed. Danny got a job at the local hardware store, working for Mr. Peterson, who'd known Harold for 30 years and was happy to hire Harold's son based on reputation alone. I helped Danny get his GED, driving him to classes and studying with him at my kitchen table. Most evenings, Danny would work in Harold's shop, building birdhouses and small furniture pieces, and I'd bring him lemonade and watch him work with the same careful attention to detail that his grandfather had possessed. The scratching sounds in my ceiling were replaced by the sound of saws and sanders from the garage, productive sounds, hopeful sounds. James called a few times, always late at night when he thought I might be more vulnerable to his manipulation, but I stopped answering his calls altogether. Michael called too, occasionally, and his conversations were different. Apologetic, uncertain, like he was trying to figure out how to maintain a relationship with both his mother and his brother.
The real surprise came about 6 weeks after Danny moved in with me. I was in my garden, planting spring vegetables with Danny's help, when a car pulled up that I didn't recognize. Out stepped a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and nervous energy, carrying a baby who looked to be about 6 months old. "Excuse me," she said, approaching our garden fence. "I'm looking for Danny Henderson. Someone at the hardware store said he might be staying here." Danny looked up from the tomato plants we'd been setting, and his whole face changed. "Sarah?" Y'all, it turns out that Sarah was Danny's girlfriend, and the baby she was carrying was Danny's son, my great-grandson, little Harold James Henderson, named for his great-grandfather, and, unfortunately, for his grandfather too, though we all agreed the Harold part was what mattered. Sarah had been looking for Danny for months, ever since she'd found out she was pregnant and he'd disappeared from his last known address. She'd been raising little Harold alone, working as a waitress and living with her sister, not knowing if Danny was alive or dead, or just didn't want to be a father. The reunion between Danny and Sarah and little Harold was something beautiful to watch, sweetie. Danny cried when he held his son for the first time. And Sarah cried when Danny explained what had happened with his father, why he'd been homeless, why he'd lost touch with everyone who cared about him. "I thought you'd run away because you didn't want the baby," Sarah said through her tears. "I ran away because I didn't have anything to offer you or the baby. Dad made me feel like I was worthless, like I'd ruin anything I touched." That's when I stepped in, because I'd had enough of James's damage affecting another generation of my family. "Well, now you have something to offer," I said, looking at the little family standing in my garden. "You have a home, a job, a grandmother who loves you, and more than enough space for a family." Sarah and little Harold moved in with us the next week, and suddenly my quiet house was full of life again. Baby cries and laughter, young voices planning for the future, the sounds of a family building itself up instead of tearing itself down. We converted Harold's old office into a nursery, and Sarah got a job at the local medical clinic where her experience as a waitress translated well to patient care. Danny proposed on Mother's Day right there in our garden, surrounded by the tomato plants and roses, and they asked me to help plan their wedding. The wedding was small, held in our backyard under the big oak tree that Harold had planted when we first moved to the house. Mr. Peterson walked Danny down the aisle since his father wasn't invited, and Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire ceremony like she was watching her own grandson get married. Michael came to the wedding, alone, and I could see him watching Danny and Sarah and little Harold with something that might have been envy. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside and asked if he could visit more often, if maybe he could build the kind of relationship with his nephew that he'd failed to build with his brother. "Michael, honey, you're always welcome in this house, but you come as family, not as someone checking up on the old lady to make sure she's making good decisions." James didn't come to the wedding, but he sent a card with no message inside, just his signature, like he couldn't think of anything to say to his own son on his wedding day. 6 months later, Sarah gave birth to little Dorothy Sarah Henderson, my great-granddaughter named for me, and when I held that baby girl in my arms, I understood that sometimes the scratching sounds in your ceiling aren't pests or problems. Sometimes they're opportunities disguising themselves as annoyances. Y'all, I'm 83 now, and my house is full of the sounds I dreamed of during all those lonely years. Children playing, young parents discussing their dreams, the busy noise of a family that actually functions. Danny graduated from community college with a degree in carpentry, and he started his own business using Harold's old tools and workshop. Sarah manages the books for Danny's business, and they've saved enough money to buy their own house just 3 blocks away, close enough for daily visits, but far enough for independence. But you know what they decided? They're not moving. They're staying right here with me, raising their children in the house where their father learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them. Every morning, I still sit at my kitchen table with my coffee and my breakfast, but now I'm joined by Danny and Sarah and the babies, and sometimes Michael, who stops by before work to have breakfast with his real family. The scratching sounds are gone, replaced by little feet running across my floors, baby laughter echoing through my hallways, and the sound of Danny working in Harold's shop, building cradles and toy boxes for his growing family. Sometimes I catch myself looking up at the ceiling and smiling, remembering those 3 months when I thought I was losing my mind, when I thought those sounds meant I was alone and going crazy. But sweetie, those scratching sounds were never about being alone. They were about family finding its way back to family.
about love that refuses to give up, even when it has to hide in dark places and make itself small. Danny wasn't just surviving in my attic. He was coming home, one scratch at a time. James still doesn't visit, still doesn't call. And you know what? That's his loss, not mine. He chose gambling and pride over his own son, chose appearances over family, chose being right over being a father. But little Harold James is growing up knowing his great-grandmother, learning woodworking from his daddy in the same shop where his great-grandpa taught those skills, surrounded by people who showed up when it mattered. Last week, we were all in the garden, me, Danny, Sarah, and the babies, planting this year's tomatoes, when little Harold pointed up at the roof and said, "Daddy, what's up there?" Danny looked at me and smiled, that same sweet smile he'd had as a child when he'd helped me bake cookies. That's where Daddy lived when he was learning how to be brave enough to ask for help. "Were you hiding?" little Harold asked, with that direct way children have of asking the questions adults dance around. "No, baby," Danny said, picking up his son and pointing to the garden, the house, all of us together. "I was finding my way home." Y'all, sometimes the things that scare us most, the sounds we can't identify, the problems we think are too big to solve, are really just opportunities wearing disguises. Sometimes the scratching in your ceiling isn't something trying to get out. It's something trying to get in, trying to become part of your life, trying to remind you that you're not as alone as you think you are. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you're brave enough to get up on that ladder and see what's really making all that noise, you'll discover that the best things in your life were right above your head the whole time, just waiting for you to notice them, just waiting for you to let them come down and join you at your kitchen table where they belonged all along. So the next time you hear mysterious sounds in your house, before you call it a pest problem or worry that you're losing your mind, consider this. Maybe those sounds are trying to tell you something important. Maybe they're trying to tell you that home isn't just a place where you live. It's a place where love finds a way to survive, even in the smallest, darkest spaces, until it's strong enough to come into the light. 3 years later, when little Dorothy took her first steps across my kitchen floor, she walked right to the spot where I used to hear those scratching sounds, looked up at the ceiling, and clapped her tiny hands like she was saying thank you to the place that brought her daddy home. And honey, I looked up at that same ceiling and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the best gifts come disguised as problems, and that family has a way of finding each other, even when we think all hope is lost." That ceiling will always be special to me, y'all. Not because of the mystery it held, but because of the love it was protecting, the family it was keeping safe until we were ready to be together again. Sometimes the scratching sounds in your life aren't trying to drive you crazy. They're trying to save you, one small sound at a time, until you're brave enough to climb up there and bring them home where they belong.